On this week's episode of Where We Are, we're going to talk about our therapeutic culture. Fun times. You're listening to Where We Are.
Hello, Where We Are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
This is Where We Are. We are the Wares. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
Melissa.
Yeah.
Hiya.
What's up?
Hey, it's good to be back for another episode of Where We Are. I had so much fun with the feedback to last week's episode. Particularly, Melissa, I think we've identified a new talent you have, and that is choosing the music for the show.
Yeah, good feedback on the music.
Yeah, people dug that.
I'm
Let's
nothing
see.
if not silly.
You're a lot of
I'm
other
a silly
things,
goose.
So. Let's see, updates. Forgot to mention it last week's episode. Washington, D.C., November 6th and 7th. The Center for Christianity and Public Life's For the Good of the Public. It's our inaugural summit. We'd love for you to be there. Go to ccpubliclife.org. There's a whole page for the conference there. You could register for tickets, and would love to see you there. I think it's going to be a really amazing time, and so would love to see you at that. And then also this week, the Center for Christianity and Public Life opened up the application for our Public Life Fellowship Program. And so if you are a Christian who is serving the public through your vocation, we'd love to have you apply. And so, again, you could go to ccpubliclife.org and do that. We'd love to receive an application from you. Melissa, anything on your end that you want folks to attend, sign up for?
I have nothing.
Do you want to tell people about this pop-up that you went to today?
Oh my gosh, yes. So on Friday, I got a TikTok of a store in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Mills outlet.
I love that you say you got a TikTok as if it was like...
It was delivered to me by the algorithm. The algorithm knows me, knows all.
Okay.
It's my best friend. Anyways.
My best friend algorithm. I would like to introduce you to my best friend algorithm. Okay, continue.
So this store at Philadelphia Mills, which is an outlet mall just north of the city of Philadelphia, a store called Reclectic, so Re-Eclectic, and it's the Anthropology Free People Urban Outfitters brand. And I didn't know this at the time until I went today, but it's a pop-up. It's very temporary, this big warehouse of heavily discounted Anthropology Free People and Urban Outfitters items that only opened 2 days ago. So I took serious shit today. We had to wait 20 minutes in line to even get in the store. We shopped around quickly because, yes, the prices were incredible. And then proceeded to stand in the checkout line with 2 cashiers for 3.5 hours. And it was one of those things where once you get an hour in, you kind of realize, oh no, I'm an hour in. Oh, how much longer is this going to take? I have a 4-year-old with me. You know, we have to tell everybody else in line that we have to go to the bathroom. Like, I don't have any water. I don't have any food. But
this is all court evidence for some case in the future. This is really great. We're putting this on for posterity.
And it's one of those things where it's kind of like, well, I've already committed 1 hour to this line, so let's see how long. And then you're 2 hours, and you're like, well, I've committed 2 hours to this line. I might as well keep going. I love teaching my daughter perseverance and resilience, especially when it comes
to deals.
To bargain hunting.
Oh,
honestly,
man.
It just reminds me of my childhood because I went shopping with my mom all the time for bargains, and when we couldn't afford it, it was always put on layaway. So, I mean, just teaching my daughter the art of a bargain. But I got 18 items for very little money. Some very pretty things that I love from Anthropologie because I do love Anthropologie, but I never shop there because I think it's way too expensive.
I mean, since her education is proceeding on this front, I wasn't planning on introducing this until she was at least 7 or 8, but I think she might be ready for the art of the deal.
Yeah.
I think she might be ready.
Is the audiobook read by Trump?
Was just going to say, should we do the audiobook or just give her the text and see what she does with it? But I think the audiobook's the way to go. But yeah, great deals. But it's a pop-up, so it only lasts
a very short time.
Okay.
So if you're anywhere near Philadelphia, totally go because there's some great home goods stuff there, let alone clothing. But be ready for the slowest checkout line you've ever been in your entire life.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was our adventure today. Saoirse and I, we got home at 10:30 p.m., 2.5 hours after her bedtime, so...
She was thrilled.
She was perfect and wonderful throughout the entire 5 hours we were inside that warehouse store. She entertained every single person around us. She made 2 new best friends, a 16-year-old and a 21-year-old. Just, honestly, it felt more Barbie than the Barbie movies with the camaraderie happening between the women in that store.
I had the same thought as you were talking to me about this whole scene. I was
yeah,
like,
so if you loved Barbie and the feeling Barbie gave you when you went and attended it in the theater... Think of that on steroids. You can totally go to the Eclectic store at Philadelphia Mills in Philadelphia.
Right, just like 95% women and
it was 100% women.
And just all of them getting like 80% off.
Yeah, sometimes 90%. I got a dress from the Farm Rio brand, which is extremely expensive, for 90% off. I mean, I should do a whole podcast episode with just like a haul of what I got. This podcast has become a pasta podcast and now has become a
we're really branching
Anthropologie
out.
Hall.
We're really
podcast.
branching out. That's what happens when you've been doing the show for so long.
Yep.
I mean, we have had Melissa, 300,000 downloads.
Yes.
Yeah, 300,000 downloads. We've done. This is our 74th episodes?
76.
Wow.
76 trombones at the counterpoint. Sorry, okay.
They were followed by rows and rows of the finest virtuoso. Okay. That was my 8th grade.
My 7th grade.
Musical.
Which is when we met.
Wow.
We met on the theater stage for Music Man Jr.
Thank you, Harold Hill. All right. We're going to get into the substance of this episode right after a quick break. You're listening to Where We Are.
Hey friends, Melissa here. It's about that time. We want to recommend another fantastic podcast on the That Sounds Fun Network, and it's Unexpected with Hannah Love. Have you ever spent much time thinking about the events that led you to where you are? Have you ever noticed that some of the most unexpected moments are the very ones that God used in the biggest ways? Not only did Hannah Love notice this theme in her own life, but she also saw it all over the Bible. From Moses and Gideon to David and Esther and Nehemiah, God seemed to call the most unqualified people to do the most unexpected things. As you listen to stories from the Bible and from her friends, she hopes you gain a new perspective of how God loves us enough to call us to the things we couldn't have imagined for ourselves. This is Unexpected. I can personally recommend 3 episodes. That's the very first episode, Purpose in Hannah's Story. Episode 8, Millennial Influence, Finding Purpose and Facing Anxiety with Shay Lee Mills. And Episode 4, Chosen, Called, Beloved, Seeing God's Hand in the Unexpected with Stacy Machuk. Unexpected takes the form of devotional-style episodes focused on a topic and a story from the Bible. So with episodes releasing every Monday, I think it's a great podcast to pair it with Where We Are's Morning 5. Tune in to Unexpected with Hannah Love. Happy listening.
we really only have one topic, although 3 articles that will kind of help us get into it. I want to talk about our therapeutic culture, a bit of how it's affecting our politics, but I think the best way to get into it is this story that ran in the New York Times last weekend about Jewish day camps. And first I'd say, they gave this Times reporter pretty incredible access.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And so, you could think about that what you will. I mean, I felt, it describes life in these camps and all the various issues these kids are dealing with. So let me back up. So this is outside of New York City, and the reporting centers around Heather Klein, who oversees NJY camps, which are a network of Jewish overnight camps in Pennsylvania, but a lot of New Yorkers send their kids there. And the story is about the mental health issues at these camps, but also, interestingly, the way that parents, counselors, and the kids themselves. I know the term social contagion has gotten sort of controversial, but it's very hard not to think it as there's just this environment where there's like a snowball effect. And so, for instance, at one point, the kids are described as therapized. They use all kinds of medical, psychological terms to refer to other kids to process their own experiences. It's also the counselors. So there's a story in here about a counselor who, a kid that was, so actually I'll read the quote. A kid that is just crying and has lost their breath because of crying, the counselor is like, she's having a panic attack, Miss Klein said. No, this is part of the problem, she added. They're all so therapized. And I took that to mean that she was referring both to the counselors and the kids and the parents, too. And that's the other piece of this. The parents are constantly calling. The parents are scanning the photos that the camp posts of their kids. And by the way, right, what would you say, 10, definitely 20 years ago, you sent your kid off to these camps.
You had no idea what they were doing.
So the fact that
they're alive,
the fact that there are these photos at all says quite a bit. Then you add on to that parents are analyzing these photos for signs that their children are unhappy or are not. Or that anything in their experience may not be ideal, and they will reach out to the camp. So there are stories here about parents pulling their kids from camp, and lack of resilience is a significant theme. So Melissa, I just found this to be a really powerful insight. I have a ton of thoughts on it. The main thing is I wanted to flag this so that others will read it. Like this really is just a story you have to read. The headline is Summer Camp, Sun, Swimming, Archery, and Therapy. And so, Melissa, a couple things I'd sort of put on the table. One, right, everyone involved here means well.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of get to this with at least one of the other stories we're talking to, which is like everybody means well. The fact that everyone means well doesn't mean that their behavior and even their perspective, their outlook should be unquestioned. Like you could mean well and yet be bought into a perspective that is not helpful, that does cause harm. And so I did read this thinking about some of the debates around public schools and also just some of the tensions like you feel as a parent about whether like what can be like, well, you know, everyone's kids are sort of going through this. It's everyone's. It's not just my kid that's in this class or my kid that's sort of being given that's watching this show. And there's like a temptation to be like what makes like me so special that I would have something to say when everyone else's kids are doing it. But this story like very clearly shows this way in which the parents, the counselors, and kids are sort of ratcheting up these anxieties, health claims. There was a part of the story that you pointed out, Melissa, something like 20% of the kids at these camps were taking meds for ADHD,
and then
15% for anxiety and depression.
And at breakfast every morning, somebody announces breakfast meds, and all those kids, line up to take their medication for whatever it is that they need it for. And I pointed out to Michael that for the kids who aren't taking medication, that it is becoming that it instills a norm to see everybody around you, and I say everybody as an over exaggeration, but see many of your peers
you have a friend
walking up and taking, these meds in front of you when you yourself don't take meds, that there's a norm being created there, a sort of, social tether that is super interesting to me. That for the kids who are unmedicated for whatever reason, either because they don't have one of those issues or, they remain unmedicated, like it's a thing to watch a ton of your friends suddenly go up and take their meds. And I don't say that as like a negative thing. I say that as a like something that is social.
Well, yeah, but it is a negative thing to the extent that it's leading kids to be put on drugs that otherwise would not be. But there's such an expectation that well, nothing's wrong with you. Like if 1 out of every 3 kids is going up at breakfast time to get meds, that does the what it must lead kids to sort of question about their own sort of lives, well-being, what they need. That like that can be that can dictate or guide behavior. So I think that's one thing I thought about. The other thing that I thought was weird about the story, and this isn't like I'm not saying this as I wish they were really critical of the religious aspect of these camps, but it is weird that they're Jewish day camps and religion never comes up in the whole story. Like if there were, other than to say that they're Jewish camps, but I kind of positively wondered, is there anything from the shared religious background, the fact that they are, like, what does it mean for it to be a Jewish day camp? Are there any religious aspects of the camp? And are those religious aspects providing any sort of salve to these kids' needs? I'll also say, like, I find it really, it's a particular kind of camp, and so like it's the fact that there's not even a paragraph sort of exploring how generalizable this is, and if not, like what's the story is reported as if this is happening with an entire generation. I think that's probably true, but the fact that they were at a specific camp in a particular geography, pulling from a particular socioeconomic status, it seemed like to me, and pulling from a particular religious background, it was just weird to not have, for how identity driven so much of journalism is these days, to not have any of those aspects sort of unpacked. Struck me as weird, like and not in a just in like a missing piece kind of way, like the full story wasn't reported. So I wish that we knew more about the role of religion in these camps. But yeah, Melissa, anything else you want to say about this story? And then this episode will kind of build, so hopefully folks will like keep the story in mind as we talk about other pieces. But anything else you wanna add?
Yeah, I just think that there's, and this will come up, I think, with the other couple of articles. It's always in the back of my mind, especially when we're talking about a therapeutic culture, is that in a therapeutic culture, you've got a lot of therapy language running around, and oftentimes I feel so inadequate to be talking about a lot of this stuff because like I ultimately don't know that much in terms of like what actually goes into an ADHD diagnosis, or what goes into saying that this child is autistic, or what does depression, anxiety actually look like in a child versus looking like an adult, and like how do you deal with these things. It even goes down to, because we've actually gotten questions before from the audience about Michael and I, our thoughts on gentle parenting and authoritative parenting, which are two very similar dynamics of parenting. And I have found that even down to, and especially because in this particular article about the Jewish day camps, it's very helicopter parenty in a lot of ways. That even down to day-to-day parenting, everything is therapized. Like you look at any like Instagram account, Twitter account, TikTok account where, it's, some self-proclaimed or somebody, with a bunch of degrees, their expertise on, this is how you gentle parent, and, for all these various psychology-based reasonings, and you should do this, otherwise your kid's going to get ruined or whatever. You're asking people, almost like, I'll use the term lay people, to use very complex systems of thinking, of approaches, of frameworks that are oftentimes based in a lot of peer-reviewed studies and sometimes not, and actually sifting through as to who is the expert and who is not is like really difficult in the first place. And then what is it actually based off of, like decades of research, or like one study that, didn't have like more than 30 participants, so it's not statistically relevant. Like, this article on the sort of like day-to-day, like what we're dealing with in terms of the fact that anxiety, depression, all sorts of things are just skyrocketing in Generation Alpha, as we've already seen with Gen Z, and with parenting sort of being therapized in so many ways, and pretty much the majority of us not having any kind of training in this stuff, any kind of real background as to like how to discern through these things. It just feels like a lot of pressure, and it feels very confusing. And for me, I read through these things and I don't know what to parse out, what is actually like a real trend and like what is contagion. Like, again, like you bring up the contagion thing, which I agree, it is like a controversial framework at this point in time, but like you can see it.
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to put that out there as like where I'm sort of sitting when I'm, going into these next couple of articles, which I think like also bring up some really excellent points about like socially, societally, where we're sort of sitting at this point.
Yeah.
Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
Get out of the trenches of tedious tasks like managing order fulfillment and start growing your business with ShipStation. They'll help increase profitability by automating your workflow with their simple, easy-to-use dashboard. With it, you can pretty much do everything you need to quickly and easily. Update order information, print labels, compare rates, optimize shipments, and even set up automatic delivery notifications. And it doesn't matter where you sell. Amazon, Etsy, eBay, Shopify, ShipStation can integrate pretty much anywhere online. Another great thing about ShipStation? They can help reduce costs with industry-leading discounted rates from some of the biggest mail carriers. You might even be able to get up to 89% off USPS and UPS rates. So, make this year your most profitable one yet. Sign up for your free 30-day trial at ShipStation.com and use the code Spotify. That's ShipStation.com with the code Spotify.
So, keeping all that in mind, let's move to this Atlantic essay from Jill Filipovich. Unclear, but we've talked about some of her writing previously on the show. She was a very in the last decade. She was a sort of well known on the blogosphere as a feminist blogger. She's now an author, written books, and has a bigger platform.
Yeah, she has a large social media following.
She wrote for The Atlantic. The title of the article is "I Was Wrong About Trigger Warnings," and in the article she sort of unpacks the reasons why she would invoke trigger warnings and promoted the use of trigger warnings as, quote, that it seemed like an easy accommodation to make for the sake of our community's well-being. We thought we were making the world just a little bit better. It didn't occur to me until much later that we might have been part of the problem. She talks about how the warnings multiplied, how the idea of a trigger warning became a cultural phenomenon. Slate declared it. They declared 2013 the year of the trigger warning. But she then tracks the decline of mental health, particularly among young girls and young women. I'll read from the essay. Since my days as a feminist blogger, mental health among teenagers has plummeted. From 2007 to 2019, the suicide rate for children ages 10 to 14 tripled. For girls in that age group, it nearly quadrupled. A 2021 CDC report found that 57% of female high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, up from 36% in 2011. That's like stunning. Like 2021 CDC report found 57% of female high school students reporting persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, which is up 21 points from just 10 years earlier. Though the pandemic undoubtedly contributed to a crash in adolescent mental health, the downturn began well before COVID hit. She goes on to relate that we know that teenage girls are reporting high rates of sexual violence and bullying. Today's teenagers are less likely to drink or use illicit drugs. So this is in the context of teenagers being less likely to drink or use illicit drugs, the percentage of children living in poverty falling, and yet these mental health issues are exploding. And she obviously she's not saying trigger warnings are to blame for all of this, but she uses that as a sort of window into, again, a sort of therapeutic culture that has grabbed hold, again, for good intentions. I really think how she framed it is right. This sort of like, well, it cost me
nothing really
to put a trigger warning, and people are asking and sometimes demanding it and saying that without it, they're being harmed. And so, like, what's the? I thought, like, what harm could I be causing? So I found this really helpful. She wrote it. She really focuses on sexual violence in particular, which for a lot of the writing she was doing, that's what a lot of the trigger warnings were about.
Basically, she says that trigger warnings have, as again, talking about trigger warnings as a gateway to talking about this larger conversations, but trigger warnings have gone from warning people who've been through specific traumas, like, hey, you're about to read about this, so if you're not in a place at this point in time to reading about it, don't read it, but if you are, go ahead, kind of thing, to, hey, everything is uncomfortable, I'm putting a trigger warning for everything so that you don't ever experience discomfort.
Right.
Those are two very distinct things, and I just really appreciated this article from Jill because, like, she's very careful in the way she writes about it, not to say that, like, trauma isn't real or anything like that, or that trigger warnings haven't been helpful to people, because, hey, I've put trigger warning for some of the stuff that we've put together in Substack because I know that there are folks reading it who, you know, I care about having a warning. I myself have appreciated them and have, you know, maybe because I'm not having a great day, have stopped reading something because, like, I know that it's going to make me feel even worse. And other days, like, I'll be able to read it. Like, I know she is just very careful to say that, like, so there's a paragraph in here that I think encompasses just how careful she was about this, that I also think is, like, sort of puts this, you know, this idea of the trigger warning into, like, a broader picture that pairs really well with that New York Times piece we just read on the Jewish camps. She says, applying the language of trauma to an event changes the way we process it. That may be a good thing, allowing a person to face a moment that truly cleaved their life into a before and an after, and to seek help and begin healing. Or it may amplify feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, elevating those feelings above a sense of competence and control. We have the saying in the mental health world, perception is reality. One of her experts that she interviewed said, so if someone is adamant that they felt something was traumatizing, that is their reality. And there's probably going to be mental health consequences from that. So Jill is, like, trying to get into this subject matter of, if we tell young people, especially who have growing and developing brains, who haven't had tons of experience with all kinds of things in this life, and who might be experiencing different things for the first time, that if everything is a trauma and everything is unsafe, they will begin to believe that. Like, that is how the human brain works in a lot of ways. And so she, in this article, is sort of apologizing, participating, and sort of bringing the culture in that direction, and that resilience, helping to create young human beings who are resilient versus basically telling young human beings that, you know, you are your trauma. Like, those are two very different ways of talking to young people and helping them to actually process through the bad things that they are going to experience in life. She doesn't, like, necessarily that, but for me, like, that's where I take it to, of life is really difficult and hard. You will go through sometimes some really horrific and awful things, and they can be varied in different ways. and you can experience them in different ways and process them in different ways. And there are, ways to get help out there to process them, but like there also should be there as well training in how to be resilient. And the current therapeutic culture is more about like life is happening at you more than that you're walking to you more than you're walking alongside your life. And as the horrific things happen, or you're reminded of your past horrific things, that there are ways of being able to cope with that.
Yeah.
Versus just to sit in it constantly and stew.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just read a bit more from the article. Most of the experts I spoke with were careful to distinguish between an individual student asking a professor for a specific accommodation to help them manage a past trauma and a cultural inclination to avoid challenging or upsetting situations entirely. Thriving requires working through discomfort and hardship, but creating the conditions where that kind of resilience is possible is as much a collective responsibility as an individual one. If we want to replace our culture of trauma with a culture of resilience, we'll have to relearn how to support one another. And so yeah, I thought it was a helpful story. The last thing I'll say on this, and again, this will be relevant as we move to the last story we're going to discuss, is and I guess I've kind of referred to this with talking about good intentions, but it's significant, I think, to point out like how in a particular online culture, being willing to use trigger warnings was an indication that you were like a good person.
Yeah.
And so I just right, the obvious question to ask is like, what are we doing now? What are the hallmarks of our sort of online culture and just social behavior broadly that people are willing to go along with now because it doesn't cost me anything. Like but this. She's not talking about that long ago. Like this revision is of something that she was doing 5-10 years ago. And so I just think that's another interesting thing to think about. Like the revisions that we're having are not even generational, Melissa.
No, they're very.
It's like
they're very.
It's like I thought this was the most important thing I could be doing like 3 years ago, and now I see that it really wasn't that meaningful, or it was harmful. And it seems like there are more and more of these kinds of things.
Yeah,
and the time frame is getting shorter and shorter.
You and I really resonate on this particular point, especially in reflective articles like this, which we're seeing more often from a lot of different leaders. Is that this happens all the time in politics? You and I are constantly, between us, saying like, oh, that person wrote that on Twitter or wrote that article. I'm pretty sure their stance on that was like a 180 about 18 months ago kind of thing. And I think it's the ability to be online and to have so much information available to you and a platform available to you to constantly be sort of pushing whatever sort of ideas that you have that you're resting on. People tend to hold a lot of this type of stuff, and like it's completely understandable why you would, very tightly and very staunchly, and argue your point. And when it's available, when you have an online platform available to you and you're able to repeat these things over and over again, then when you go and change your mind, or you see the negative consequences of the position you thought was once so good to have, that's when it becomes more of like, if things have been feeling more and more like a whiplash, or like a wow, we constantly seem to be reimagining exactly like socially how we should conduct ourselves and what our society should actually be built on and look like. It's because of this constant availability due to the digital presence of, all of our opinions and our thoughts and our policies and political stances, ideologies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I think that's right, Melissa. I just wanted to close because David Brooks wrote for the Times just a few days ago, bringing into contact something we talked about on this show. I mean, we've talked about therapeutic culture before.
Yes.
And we've talked specifically about Christopher Lasch.
We have.
We've been reading often together through Lasch's books. And I've been promoting that folks gain familiarity with Lasch
And it's not because his views are perfect. It's
No.
because
But he is tapping into something that seems to be salient in this moment. Mark Lilla, the academic, wrote an article about the right in France, and he profiled a sort of an emerging center right that was not hyper nationalistic like Le Pen, but also wasn't the left like young people are often sort of assumed to be, but a sort of often Catholic center right movement. And he noted in that article that they were all reading Lasch, and this was maybe a 2014, 2015 article. It wasn't like an article from the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's when I started picking up some of Lasch's work. He wrote a book in 1979 called The Culture of Narcissism, that is significantly about a therapeutic culture that was developing. David. So David talks quite a bit about this. He opens op-ed, "If I were asked to trace the decline of the American psyche, I suppose I would go to a set of cultural changes that started directly after World War II and built over the next few decades, when writers as diverse as Philip Rieff, Christopher Lasch, and Tom Wolfe noticed the emergence of what came to be known as the therapeutic culture." He continues a bit later on, as Lasch wrote in his 1979 book, The Culture of Narcissism, such people are plagued by an insecurity that can be, quote, overcome only by seeing his grandiose self reflected in the attentions of others. Plagued by anxiety, depression, vague discontents, a sense of inner emptiness, the psychological man of the 20th century seeks neither individual self-aggrandizement nor spiritual transcendence, but peace of mind under conditions that increasingly militate against it. Brooks goes on to recap some of the information. I mean, in some cases, some of the very information that is covered in Jill's article, including that Slate magazine proclaimed 2013 the year of the trigger warning, and some of the mental health data that we saw. Interestingly, Brooks brings up the book The Body Keeps the Score, which I think he's right, became a defining cultural artifact of the 2010s. I was hearing about it not just in churches. It was coming up all the time in sort of religious contexts. That this was the body keeps the score was a salient concept. And then David goes on to talk about how this is sort of encroaching on and affecting our politics. So what happens when you have folks when you have a culture that where life is happening to you, then taking that to our politics and expecting our politics to to react and account for that. He writes, the instability of the self has created an immature public culture, impulsive, dramatic, erratic, and cruel, in institution after institution, from churches to schools to nonprofits. The least mature voices dominate and hurl accusations, while the most mature lie low, trying to get through the day. The people with these loudest voices often operate in that histrionic manner that suggests that they are trying to work out personal wounds through political expression. People on all sides genuinely come to believe they are powerless, unwilling to assume any responsibility for their plight, another classic symptom of immaturity. And so he goes on to call for a sort of, a return of maturity in our culture and our politics. But yeah, Melissa, I thought this was a good. I do think there's a strong tie between therapeutic culture and, as I've put it, people going to politics to try and get emotional and spiritual needs met. Like, I think there's a direct line to be drawn. But what did you think of David's piece, and just the conversation generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I mean, you and I had talked around 8 or 9 months ago, and I had said to you, I get this sense or feeling that the pendulum is starting to swing back on the therapeutic culture. I said this out loud too, and just to you. Yeah. I was just starting to see some things, and then with this spate of pretty mainstream writing on this, just in this last week, this single week. First of all, I'll couch everything in that. I hope this pendulum doesn't swing back so far that we take everything bad out of a non-therapeutic culture and then make that our sort of idol. But so I'll just put that out there, set that aside. Brooks's op-ed also gets to a part of what Jill Filipovich in The Atlantic gets at, which is this focus on the self, the focus on the individual, which obviously Lash in The Culture of Narcissism focuses on a ton, that the 1970s was marked by this sudden turn towards considering the self being, above all, the most important thing to be focusing on. And, Jill and hers is kind of collectively, we're going to be able to address our mental health crisis and, the crisis around everything being therapized, both things happening at once. We're only going to get to that if we actually work together. It's not going to happen on an individual level. And, Brooks's article dives into that as well, as sort of this problem with only focusing on self-growth, self-development, that sort of thing. And the only thing that I want to point out that you quoted, David writing here around, it was right after the end of World War II, and then, into the 70s, where this sort of therapeutic culture in this, he calls it the nascent form, sort of came about. And I also just want to point out that World War II, the United States didn't get involved right away, but got involved, in the 40s, and a lot of men fought in that war, and a lot of them came back completely and utterly traumatized, and then had pretty much
yeah,
there were supports for them, but supports for anything but actually processing the fact that they had just gone through a horrific war. Then we had the Korean War, and then we had the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War came with a whole, an entire, just a ton of baggage politically, that it's not surprising that the 70s and the 80s looked like what it did, and now we have a sort of repeating of that. When World War II caused, it's funny, I don't know if this is irony, funny enough, caused a lot of trauma that went completely unaddressed, unaccounted for, and then, we got this focus. I want to point that out as a special feature of our history.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I think we'll wrap it up there, but interested in what listeners think. I would recommend obviously that you look at all the articles we mentioned. Would recommend that you read Lash's The Culture of Narcissism, which is they released, I think it was a 20 or 30 year edition of the book.
Yeah.
That I think E.J. Dionne wrote a new foreword for. But would recommend you check that out. But that's all we have for this week's episode of Where We Are. We will be taking a break next week. I will be speaking in St. Petersburg, Florida on next Sunday, August 20th at 6 p.m. at City Church in St. Petersburg, Florida. So if you're in the St. Petersburg, Tampa, Orlando region, would love to see you out for this great event. I'm really looking forward to it. All right, that's really all we have now. Thanks for listening to Where We Are. We are the Wares.
Bye.
Bye.
It's the end of the weekend, but I still wanna turn up. Yeah, I still wanna turn up. All I want is to go again, but you ain't